Krazak stomped into the Void Walker, a dingy bar nestled in the least reputable section of Nexus 7 space station. His massive armored frame barely fit through the entrance, forcing him to duck his head and tuck in his secondary arms. The 4 battle scars running across his craggy face glowed faintly purple in the dim light, a proud marker of the Dravaki warrior caste that had cost him an eye and earned him the title Scourge of the Epsilon Quadrant. "Bartender, cracks his venom, double pour," he growled, slamming his credit chip onto the synthetic wood counter hard enough to make the nearby glasses rattle. The multi-limbed Vexlorian bartender didn't flinch. "You didn't last long running a bar on Nexus 7 if you were easily intimidated." "Coming right up, Commander," he responded, 4 of his arms simultaneously preparing the caustic green liquid, while another wiped down the counter where Krazak's entrance had disturbed a fine layer of space dust. "Not a commander anymore," Krazak corrected with a snort, "just passing through this pathetic excuse for a neutral zone." His singular remaining eyes scanned the bar's occupants with practiced efficiency. 3 Quilorians huddled in a corner booth, probably smugglers, a pair of Zethkari diplomats pretending to be inconspicuous and failing miserably with their ceremonial headgear, some miscellaneous species he couldn't be bothered to identify, and, he almost missed it, a human. How peculiar. Humans rarely ventured this far from their protected zones. The human sat alone, nursing some amber liquid, looking ridiculously soft and vulnerable. No exoskeleton, no natural armor, no redundant organs visible. Just smooth, easily punctured skin and fragile limbs. Krazak couldn't help but emit the distinctive 3-toned chuckle of his species. The galaxy's greatest cosmic joke was how these squishy creatures had somehow secured a seat at the Galactic conclave. "Something amusing, Commander?" the bartender asked, sliding the bubbling venom across the counter. "Just observing the human," Krazak replied, downing half his drink in one swallow. "How do they survive without someone to protect them? Look at those arms. Barely enough muscle to lift a Dravaki ceremonial knife, let alone wield it." The bartender's eye stalk swiveled nervously between Krazak and the human. "I wouldn't underestimate that one," he said, lowering his voice. "Been coming here for 3 cycles. Keeps to himself." "Haha, what's he going to do, negotiate me to death?" Krazak drained his glass and slammed it down. "Another!" As the bartender prepared a second drink, the door hissed open, admitting a rowdy group of Jeruvian miners, their exoskeletons still caked with asteroid dust. They stumbled toward the bar, knocking into tables and chairs with their bulky frames. "Watch it!" Krazak snarled, as one bumped his shoulder. The Jeruvian turned, mandibles clicking aggressively. "Got a problem, Scarface?" The bar fell silent. Everyone knew Dravaki warriors didn't back down from challenges. Their neural physiology literally wouldn't allow it. Krazak rose to his full height, towering over the Jeruvian, secondary arms unfolding from his torso. "Choose your next words carefully, Rock-Eater," Krazak rumbled, his combat glands already secreting the pre-battle hormones that would enhance his strength and dull pain receptors. The Jeruvian took a step forward, then went flying across the room as something collided with him from the side. That something, Krazak realized with disbelief, was the human. "Sorry about that," the human said, standing between Krazak and the dazed Jeruvian. "My friend here had a rough day in the asteroid belt. Too much radiation, not enough oxygen." He extended a hand toward the Dravaki warrior. "I'm Alex." Krazak stared at the outstretched hand, baffled by both the gesture and the intervention. Humans were known to be non-confrontational diplomat types. This made no sense. "You dare interfere with a Dravaki honor challenge?" he growled. The human Alex shrugged. "Just saving you the paperwork. Station security's been cracking down on bar fights, 3-cycle mandatory detention." He gestured toward his table. "Join me for a drink instead? My treat." Before Krazak could respond, the bartender leaned in and whispered, "Take the offer, Commander. Trust me." The strange warning in the Vexlorian's voice gave Krazak pause. Around him he noticed other patrons watching with an odd mixture of anticipation and, was that concern? For him? "Fine," he finally said. "But I choose the drink. Wouldn't have it any other way." Alex replied with an easy smile that somehow made Krazak more unsettled than if he'd brandished a weapon. As they settled at the human's table, Krazak couldn't shake the sensation that he was missing something important. The human looked so ordinary, male from what Krazak could determine, with short brown hair and eyes that matched his drink, average height for his species, which meant he barely reached Krazak's chest, no visible augmentations or weapons. He wore simple station-issue clothing, utilitarian pants, boots, and a jacket with numerous pockets. "So, what brings a Dravaki warrior to this corner of space?" Alex asked, signaling for another round. "Reconnaissance," Krazak answered gruffly. "My clan is considering expanding our territory." Ambitious. The Quanto sector is pretty firmly under Zethkari protection, though." Krazak narrowed his eye. "You're well informed for a human." Alex laughed, a surprisingly pleasant sound. "Just a history buff. The shifting borders of galactic powers make for interesting study." Their drinks arrived. Krazak's venom and another of whatever amber liquid the human faved. "To new acquaintances," Alex proposed, raising his glass. Krazak reluctantly clinked his glass against the human's. As they drank, he noticed more patrons glancing their way, some even moving closer to overhear their conversation. "You've attracted quite an audience," Krazak observed. "Oh, that's not for me," Alex replied with another of those unsettling smiles. "They're hoping for a story exchange." Krazak's interest piqued immediately. Story exchanges were a time-honored tradition among spacefaring species. Warriors sharing tales of conquest and glory. It was how reputations spread across the galaxy, how alliances were formed and enemies made. "You're proposing a cravat?" Krazak asked, using the Dravaki term. "If that's what you call it. We humans have our own version. We call it trying to out-bullshit each other over drinks," Alex chuckled. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a storyteller." That settled it. The human was clearly challenging him, and no Dravaki warrior could refuse such a challenge. "Very well," Krazak announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "A formal cravat with the human?" A ripple of excitement went through the bar. Chairs scraped as patrons pulled closer, forming a loose circle around their table. The bartender, looking simultaneously worried and resigned, brought over a bottle of some potent-looking blue liquid and 6 small glasses. "Traditional rules," the Vexlorian explained, setting everything down. 3 stories each. After each story, both drink. If you think the other is lying, challenge. If proven wrong, you drink twice." "Acceptable," Krazak agreed, then turned to Alex. "As the challenged, I go first." Alex gestured for him to proceed, looking far too relaxed for someone about to engage in verbal combat with a Dravaki war veteran. Krazak cleared his throat and began his first tale. "During the Pleiades conflict, my battlecruiser was ambushed by 3 Quilorian dreadnoughts." He paused dramatically, surveying his audience. The Quilorians in the corner shifted uncomfortably. "We were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcements. The logical move was surrender." He bared his teeth in what passed for a Dravaki smile. "Instead, I ejected in a one-person survival pod, magnetized it to the hull of the lead dreadnought, cut through with my Uxalvik's blade," he patted the ceremonial knife at his belt, "and single-handedly fought my way to the bridge. I killed 17 elite guards before reaching the Admiral. Once I had him hostage, I demanded the surrender of all 3 vessels." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the audience. It was a good story, mostly true, though he'd embellished the guard count. "They had no choice but to comply," Krazak concluded. "That's how I earned my first command and my first battle scar." He traced the lowest of the glowing marks on his face. The crowd nodded appreciatively. It was a solid war story, heroic but believable, especially for a Dravaki. Krazak turned to Alex, expecting to see awe or at least respect. Instead, the human just nodded politely and took the offered drink. "Impressive resourcefulness," he commented, downing the blue liquid without so much as a grimace. Slightly annoyed by the underwhelming reaction, Krazak launched into his second story. This one involved the infamous siege of Drakon Prime, where he'd led a small strike team behind enemy lines to sabotage the planetary shield generators. He described in vivid detail fighting through subterranean caverns infested with flesh-eating parasites, losing half his team but completing them. We held the line for 3 standard days, he boasted, breathing recycled air, eating nothing but emergency rations and parasite meat. By the time the shields fell, my armor was more blood than metal. He indicated the second scar. This one came from a native's poisoned blade. I had to cauterize it myself with my blaster set to maximum. More appreciative noises from the audience. One Zethkari diplomat actually applauded, but again Alex merely nodded, looking neither impressed nor skeptical. Your turn, human, Krazak prompted, irritation growing. Unless you concede the superior quality of Dravaki war stories? Alex smiled that infuriating smile again. Oh, I should probably go, but I really don't have anything that compares. Human conflicts are pretty mundane. Convenient excuse, Krazak scoffed, but the rules of Cravat require you to share, unless you forfeit? Fine, Alex sighed, sitting forward. Let me think. Well, there was this thing humans called the Great War, or World War I, about 500 Earth years ago, before we even left our home planet. He took a sip of his regular drink. Not very interesting really, just millions of humans living in trenches, basically ditches dug into the ground. They'd live there for months, standing in water and mud up to their knees until their feet literally rotted while still attached to their bodies. Krazak blinked. Surely he'd misheard. Their feet rotted? Oh yeah, trench foot they called it. Nasty business. But that was the least of their worries. See, they had this new weapon called mustard gas, a yellow cloud that would burn any exposed skin and, if inhaled, would fill your lungs with fluid so you'd essentially drown on dry land. Alex scratched his chin casually. The gas masks they developed weren't always effective. Sometimes soldiers would need to urinate on cloth and hold it to their faces. Something in the human waste neutralized some of the chemicals, you see. But even if you survived the gas, you might go blind or suffer chemical burns for the rest of your life. He chuckled, actually chuckled. Then there were the artillery bombardments. Imagine shells the size of your torso raining down for days without stopping. The noise alone drove many soldiers insane. They called it shell shock. Your brain just broke. Men would be found wandering no man's land, laughing hysterically, or frozen in a permanent flinch. Krazak stared, his drink forgotten. This was a single conflict? Oh, just the beginning of one, Alex replied. It lasted 4 years, roughly 9 million combatant deaths, plus about 8 million civilians. Peanuts compared to what came later, of course. The bar had gone completely silent. Even the hardened spacers looked disturbed. Krazak couldn't help himself. You're lying. No species would subject itself to such conditions. Challenge noted, Alex said calmly. He glanced around. Anyone here with access to the Galactic database want to fact-check? One of the Zethkari diplomats raised a datapad. I can verify. Searching Human World War I. There was a pause as information scrolled across the screen. The diplomat's face turned a pale shade of its normal color. The human's account is actually understated. There are images. Don't show them, Alex advised. They're rather graphic. Krazak found himself drinking twice, as required by the rules. How, he began, then had to start again. How did your species survive such a conflict? Alex shrugged. That's the thing about humans, we're adaptable. Krazak felt a new sensation, something rare for a Dravaki warrior. It took him a moment to recognize it as unease. My third and final story, Krazak announced, trying to regain control of the exchange. He launched into his most impressive tale, the boarding action against the legendary Hegemon's flagship during the Battle of the Black Spiral. He described the zero-gravity combat in excruciating detail, how he'd personally defeated the Hegemon's cybernetically enhanced honor guard before facing the tyrant himself. We fought for 7 standard hours, Krazak declared, pointing to his missing eye. He took my eye, I took his head. When I presented it to the Dravaki High Command, they granted me command of the entire Epsilon fleet, and this, he traced the 4th and final scar, the one that ran from his missing eye down to his jaw. The crowd responded with the appropriate awe, but it felt hollow now. Even Krazak himself felt his story, once his proudest achievement, somehow diminished. Alex nodded respectfully and took his drink. "Your people have a proud warrior tradition," he acknowledged. "Your second story, human," Krazak prompted, almost dreading what would come next. Alex sighed as if reluctant. "Well, after that first global conflict I mentioned, humans had an even bigger one about 20 years later. World War II. Creative name, I know." He leaned back, oddly relaxed. "This time we added some new elements. There was this thing called strategic bombing, basically deliberate targeting of civilian populations to destroy morale. Entire cities reduced to rubble overnight. Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, tens of thousands of non-combatants killed in single bombing raids." Krazak's mandibles twitched in disbelief. "Your military targeted your own species, civilians, deliberately?" "Oh, absolutely. Both sides did it. There was a whole doctrine developed around it. How many civilians you needed to kill before a population would demand surrender." Alex took a casual sip of his drink. "Then there were the death camps." "Death camps?" one of the Quilorians asked, voice barely audible. "Yeah, facilities designed specifically for the efficient extermination of undesirable human populations. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, bodies burned in specially designed crematoriums, very systematic. About 6 million killed just for their genetic heritage or beliefs. The bar was so quiet you could hear the station's recycling systems humming in the background. "That's not warfare," Krazak objected. "That's extinction-level insanity." Alex shrugged. "We call it genocide. Humans have conducted quite a few of them throughout our history. We're actually pretty efficient at it when we put our minds to it." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Want to challenge the factual accuracy of this one too?" Krazak didn't. Somehow he knew it was all true. "Is this why your species was granted conclave membership?" he asked instead. "Out of fear." Alex laughed. "Oh no, we weren't even close to our peak destructive potential then. That came later with my final story." He glanced around. "If everyone's up for it?" Several patrons looked like they wanted to leave, but no one moved. The horrified fascination in the room was palpable. "We developed these weapons called nuclear bombs," Alex began conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Single devices that could obliterate entire cities in a flash. We actually used 2 on civilian targets to end that Second World War I mentioned." He made an explosive gesture with his hands. Flash of light and poof, city gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The radiation afterward. Your skin would slough off, your hair would fall out, your organs would liquefy inside you, but you'd stay conscious through most of it. Children born years later would have mutations, extra limbs, missing features. Krazak found himself frozen in his seat, unable to process what he was hearing. "But even that wasn't enough for us," Alex continued almost cheerfully. "We kept building bigger bombs. At our peak, we had enough to destroy our entire planet several times over. We called it mutually assured destruction, the doctrine that no one would start a nuclear war if everyone would die as a result." He laughed and shook his head. "The funny thing is we came close to launching them several times, once because of a computer glitch, another time because of migrating geese that showed up on radar. Once, a single submarine officer refused to launch when ordered to. That guy literally saved our entire species." The blue liquid sat untouched as Alex finished his tale. "After that, we figured we should probably get off-world, spread the risk, you know. Can't extinct a species if they're on multiple planets." The silence that followed was absolute. Krazak realized he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his claws had punctured the synthetic material. "You're telling me," he finally managed, "that your species nearly exterminated itself, multiple times, by accident?" "Well, not entirely by accident. We designed the systems that way," Alex clarified. "Built our civilization on the edge of a knife, basically daring ourselves to slip." "But why?" asked one of the Zethkari diplomats, voice trembling. Alex shrugged. "Seemed like a good idea at the time." He raised his drink. To survival against the odds? Krazak couldn't move. His battle-hardened mind was struggling to comprehend a species that would develop and use such weapons against itself, that would intentionally target its own young, that would create conditions specifically to inflict maximum suffering. You know what the real kicker is? Alex added, seemingly oblivious to the horror he'd induced. I'm not even a soldier. I'm a historian. I just study this stuff. Krazak found his voice. You mean you've never experienced combat yourself? Nope. Never fired a weapon in anger. Never had to. Alex smiled. Modern humans are actually pretty peaceful by our standards. We haven't had a global conflict in centuries. Got it all out of our system, I guess. But these are stories, Krazak gestured helplessly. They're taught to your young? Oh sure, basic history curriculum. Every human child learns about world wars, genocides, nuclear proliferation. It's part of our heritage. Alex leaned forward conspiratorially. Want to know something really interesting? The weapons I described, those were primitive by today's standards. What we have now is... He whistled softly. Krazak had seen enough combat to recognize when he was outmatched. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. I concede the cravat, he announced formally, using the ritual phrase. Your war stories exceed mine in both horror and glory. Alex looked genuinely surprised. Really? But I didn't even get to biological warfare or... No, Krazak interrupted quickly. The exchange is complete. You are victorious. The bar remained silent as Krazak tossed back his final drink. As the potent liquid burned down his throat, he found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the galaxy's power dynamics. Tell me, he said quietly, so only Alex could hear, does the Conclave know about your species' true nature? Alex's expression turned thoughtful. I suspect they know enough. We've never hidden our history. It's all in the databases. Then why would they let us join? Probably because we're really good at making peace once we've exhausted ourselves with war. Alex stood and offered his hand again. It was nice meeting you, Commander Krazak. I hope your reconnaissance mission is successful. This time, Krazak took the offered hand, careful not to crush the fragile human bones with his grip. I shall be revising my report to my clan, he said stiffly. I believe our expansion plans may need reconsideration. Alex nodded understandingly. Probably wise. We humans have a saying. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We try very hard not to repeat our mistakes. The unspoken implication hung in the air between them, and we'd prefer if no one forced us to demonstrate what we've learned. As Alex left the bar, Krazak noticed the other patrons giving him a wide berth. The human had seemed so harmless, small, soft, friendly even. Yet he carried the casual knowledge of horrors that would make hardened Dravaki warriors wake screaming in the night. More venom? The bartender offered, approaching cautiously. Krazak shook his head. Information. Tell me, how many humans reside on this station? About 200, the Vexlorian replied. Mostly researchers, traders, a few diplomats. And they all know these war stories? The bartender's eye stalks quivered in what might have been amusement. Commander, what you heard tonight, those are just the highlights from a single planet's history, from before they even achieved spaceflight. You should hear what happened when they started colonizing their own solar system. Krazak didn't want to hear. For the first time in his long, battle-filled life, the Dravaki warrior felt a chill of genuine fear. Not for himself, but for his entire species. I must contact my clan immediately, he mumbled, moving toward the exit. Commander, the bartender called after him, a word of advice. When dealing with humans, remember, they look harmless because they don't need to look dangerous. Everything that could threaten them, they've already done to themselves, and survived. Krazak nodded grimly. As he stepped out into the artificial night cycle of Nexus 7, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a human lurking in the shadows. There were none visible, of course, but for the first time, that didn't reassure him at all. 3 cycles later, when the Dravaki High Command received his comprehensive report on the Quanta sector, They were surprised to find his risk assessment of the human presence upgraded from negligible to extreme. Even more surprising was his unprecedented recommendation: maintain maximum safe distance, initiate diplomatic relations only, under no circumstances provoke. When questioned about this dramatic reversal, Commander Krazak would only say, "I heard their war stories, trust me. You don't want them to tell you any new ones." The High Command, puzzled but respectful of the decorated commander's judgment, followed his recommendation. It would be many years before they understood the wisdom of his caution, but by then, thankfully, humans and Dravaki were well on their way to becoming allies rather than enemies. Sometimes, Krazak reflected with grim humor, the most effective warfare was simply telling stories about it over drinks. 10 standard cycles later, Krazak found himself back on Nexus 7, this time in an official capacity. The Dravaki hegemony had finally established formal diplomatic relations with the human cooperative, and he had been selected, against his vehement protests, to serve as cultural liaison. "The human delegation requests your presence at Docking Bay 12, his communication unit chirped as he settled into his temporary quarters. Krazak sighed, adjusting his formal diplomatic armor. Gone were the battle-scarred plates he'd once worn with pride, replaced by polished ceremonial gear that felt constraining and pointless. The glowing scars on his face remained, of course. Those were permanent markers of his status, but everything else about his current assignment made him feel like an imposter. As he lumbered toward the docking bay, he rehearsed the formal greeting protocols he'd been forced to memorize. The Dravaki High Command had been explicit. Nothing must go wrong with these negotiations. The humans had recently demonstrated some new propulsion technology that had the entire Galactic conclave buzzing, and the hegemony wanted access to it. "Just smile and don't mention any of their atrocities," his superior had instructed before sending him off, "and for the Void's sake, don't challenge them to any kind of competition." The docking bay doors hissed open, revealing a sleek, gunmetal grey vessel unlike any Krazak had seen before. No visible weapons emplacements, minimal defensive shielding, yet somehow, knowing what he knew about humans, the ship seemed all the more menacing for its apparent lack of armaments. A ramp extended from the ship's underside and 3 figures descended. 2 were obviously security personnel, wearing the simple black uniforms of the Human Cooperative Defense Force. The third, "Commander Krazak," a familiar voice called out. What a pleasant surprise. Krazak's singular eye widened in shock. "Ambassador Alexander Thompson," he managed to respond, using the formal title he'd been briefed to expect. "I did not anticipate being recognized." Alex, the very same human from that fateful night in the Voidwalker, grinned as he approached. "How could I forget the only Dravaki warrior to ever buy me a drink? Well, technically you lost it to me in that story exchange, but still." The 2 security officers exchanged glances, but remained professionally blank-faced. Krazak wondered if they too carried the casual knowledge of horrors that Alex did. Probably. According to his briefing, all humans underwent something called basic education that included their species' bloody history. "I have been assigned as your cultural liaison," Krazak said stiffly, falling back on protocol when unsure how to proceed. "Fantastic," Alex exclaimed, clapping him on one armored shoulder with surprising familiarity. "I specifically requested someone with actual combat experience rather than some political appointee. Didn't expect to get you, though. This is going to be great." Krazak wasn't so sure. "The official reception will begin in 3 standard hours. I am to escort you to your accommodations and brief you on the proceedings." Of course," Alex agreed, falling into step beside him. The security officers followed at a discreet distance. "But first, I was hoping we could stop by the Voidwalker." "For old time's sake?" The very thought made Krazak's secondary stomach clench. "I do not believe that will be appropriate before the formal reception." "Ah, come on," Alex cajoled. "I've got a new story to tell you." Those words sent a chill down Krazak's spine. "A war story." Alex laughed. No, nothing like that. Actually, it's about how your report changed everything." Krazak stopped abruptly. nearly causing one of the security officers to bump into him. "My report?" "Yes," Alex's expression turned serious. "Your risk assessment of human presence in the Quantos sector. It was quite the topic of discussion when it reached certain circles within the conclave." Unease rippled through Krazak's primary nervous system. That report was classified. "Indeed it was," Alex agreed cheerfully, which made it all the more interesting when it appeared on the desk of the Human Cooperative's intelligence director. They had resumed walking, but Krazak's mind was racing faster than his feet. Had he inadvertently triggered some interstellar incident? Was this seemingly friendly diplomatic mission actually a pretext for... "You single-handedly prevented what could have been a very unfortunate misunderstanding between our species," Alex continued, interrupting Krazak's spiraling thoughts. "The Dravaki expansion plans for the Quantos sector would have eventually brought your people into conflict with one of our research outposts, an outpost conducting some rather sensitive experiments." "What kind of experiments?" Krazak couldn't help asking, even as he dreaded the answer. Alex's smile turned enigmatic. "Let's just say they involve the fundamental fabric of space-time, and leave it at that for now." He patted Krazak's arm again. "The point is, your assessment prompted both a strategic reassessment from your high command and a diplomatic overture from ours. And now here we are, on the verge of a historic partnership." They had reached the VIP guest quarters. Alex paused before the entrance and looked up at Krazak with an expression the Dravaki couldn't quite decipher. "You know," the human said thoughtfully, "there's another aspect of human history I never got around to telling you about that night. Our capacity for friendship, for seeing potential allies where others might see only enemies." He extended his hand, just as he had in the bar all those cycles ago. "I think our species have a lot to offer each other, Commander." Krazak stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Everything he knew about humans, their terrifying military history, their casual relationship with planet-killing weapons, their ability to endure conditions that would break most species, told him to be wary. But there was something else there too, a species that had done its worst to itself and emerged not broken but tempered. A people who carried the knowledge of their darkest moments as a vaccination against repeating them. Perhaps, Krazak reflected as he finally took the human's hand, that was the most valuable lesson he'd learned from that night of war stories. Not that humans were dangerous, though they certainly were, but that they had faced their own capacity for self-destruction and chosen a different path. 3 hours until the reception, he reminded Alex. "Please be punctual." "Wouldn't miss it," Alex assured him with that now familiar smile. "Oh, and Krazak, bring your stories. The diplomatic team would love to hear about that time you took down the Hegemon's flagship. Just maybe leave out the head presenting part. Some of my colleagues have sensitive stomachs." As Krazak departed, he found himself almost looking forward to the reception. Almost. He would still make sure the bar served nothing stronger than diluted Terran wine. Some war stories were best left untold, at least until the treaties were signed. Word spread quickly through the Galactic community about the unprecedented alliance between the Draga hegemony and the Human Cooperative. Most species were baffled by the pairing, the proud, militant Draga hegemony warriors joining forces with the seemingly soft, diplomatic humans. It defied conventional wisdom. Speculation ran rampant. Some suggested the humans must have blackmailed the Dravaki leadership. Others theorized that the Dravaki had discovered some weakness in human physiology they planned to exploit. The most popular theory involved a shared enemy so terrible it forced these unlikely allies together. None guessed the truth, that a chance encounter in a dingy bar had revealed to one influential Dravaki warrior the one thing more terrifying than facing humans in battle, the prospect of humans being forced to invent new weapons. In the Voidwalker, the Vexlorian bartender had added a new drink to the menu, the Diplomat's Nightmare, a swirling mixture of Kraxis venom and Terran whiskey that rarely failed to prompt the question, why would anyone combine these? To which the bartender always replied, with his eye stalks quivering in amusement, sometimes the most unexpected combinations turn out to be the most effective. And somewhere in the diplomatic quarter of Nexus 7, a Dravaki warrior and a human historian raised glasses of exactly that concoction, toasting to the stories they hoped would never need to be told.